Good morning, psychology. Okay, so it is week 5. Today we are going to lecture, or I'm going to lecture on psychological measurement. So I will be uploading this PowerPoint slide as well in black and white for you guys, just because it was suggested just because some of you print them out and write notes while you guys watch. So that's up for you right now if you choose. And yeah, let's get right to it. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And we can get started on week 5, chapter 5, psychological measurement. As usual with every single PowerPoint slide, there are learning objectives. You can also find a condensed version of these learning objectives in our Blackboard website right at the beginning of the week 5 module. But again, do not just bypass these learning objectives. Actually take your time at the end of your reading. So once you've completed your reading, once you maybe have watched this if you choose to, once you've done your assignments, go back to the learning objectives. Do you know what reliability is? Can you explain how you would decide whether to use an existing measure or create your own, etc.? Quiz yourself at the end of these lectures. Okay, so don't just bypass them. But before we begin, as usual, I always have like a slight introduction for you guys. So we start, okay? Our ability to answer empirical research questions in psychology depends on our ability to measure psychological variables. If we could not measure things like intelligence, extroversion, and depression, there would be no science of psychology. It may seem very difficult to students, for you guys, to measure intangible things such as self-esteem and mood. However, as psychologists have proven, it is possible to do so by studying the nature of variables. Now, moving on to what is measurement. So of course, at the beginning of every single chapter that we read, our author, Paul Price, is going to go over some crucial definitions at the beginning and also sprinkle some throughout. But what is measurement? Measurement is the assignment of scores to individuals so that the scores represent some characteristic of the individual. Once again, measurement is the assignment of scores to individuals so that the scores represent some characteristic of the individuals. Psychological measurement, on the other hand, is often referred to as psychometrics. Measurement does not require any particular instruments or procedures. It requires some kind of systematic procedure for assigning scores to individuals so that those scores represent the characteristic of interest. So for example, okay, a clinical psychologist who is interested in how depressed or depression in a person is administers the Beck Depression Inventory or the Beck Depression Survey, which is a 21-item self-report questionnaire in which a person rates the extent to which he or she has felt sadness and other symptoms of depression. The sum of these ratings represents the person's current level of depression, okay? So that is an example. The Beck Depression Inventory, or the Beck Depression Survey, is an example of psychometrics, psychological measurement, okay? Some variables can be very difficult to measure because they cannot directly be observed. These are called constructs. Constructs include personality traits, emotional states, attitudes, and abilities, okay? They often represent tendencies. So constructs often represent tendencies to think, feel, or act in certain ways. They also involve internal processes and are not obvious to outside observers. So these are things such as fear, okay, which is, you know, like a complex set of behaviors and internal processes, okay? So things such as fear are examples of constructs. Again, because a construct can include things such as personality traits, emotions, which fear is, attitudes, and abilities. Okay? The conceptual definition of a psychological construct describes the behaviors and internal processes that make up that construct, along with how it relates to other variables. We can conceptually define neuroticism as a person's tendency to experience negative emotions across a variety of situations. Okay? So here we have a figure. Again, this figure can be found in chapter 5 specifically. Let me move my face down here, actually. Okay, so here we have a figure of the big 5 personality dimensions. Again, emotions, attitudes, etc. These are things that are constructs in psychology, okay? It's a type of measure that we have. The big 5 dimensions here are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, and then the facets that they can manifest themselves in, okay? So this is just a chart that kind of organizes them, but again, these are things that, these are constructs, okay, that we oftentimes have difficulty observing, okay, because they're internal, they're not outside of our bodies, okay? So just pause for a second and take a look at this, okay? So again, we were just talking about psychological measurement as a form of psychometrics, okay? And these are examples right here. The big 5 personality dimensions are examples of constructs, which can include personality traits, emotional states, attitudes, and abilities, okay? Now moving on to operational definitions. So we're still, Paul Price is still defining terms, okay, when it comes to psychological measurement. So an operational definition is a definition of a variable in terms of how precisely it is to be measured. They fall into 3 broad categories: self-report measures, behavioral measures, and physiological measures. So first, self-report measures. Self-report measures are those in which self-report measures are those in which participants report on their own thoughts, feelings, and actions. So an example of a self-report measure, right, would be the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which our author describes. Behavioral measures are those in which some other aspect of participants' behavior is observed and recorded, okay? So an example of this could be a person's working memory like capacity. And then physiological measures are those that involve recording any of a wide variety of physiological processes such as heart rate, blood pressure, hormone levels, etc. Okay? For any given variable or construct, there will be multiple operational definitions. Stress, for example, is conceptually defined as an adaptive response to a perceived danger or threat that involves physiological, cognitive, affective, and behavioral components. It is operationally defined through the social readjustment rating scale, the daily hassles and uplift scales, and others. It is operationally defined in terms of several physiological variables, including blood pressure and level of the stress hormone, cortisol. Okay. When a psychologist uses multiple operational definitions of the same construct, they are using converging operations, okay? Its advantage is that when scores based on several different operational definitions are closely related to each other and produce similar patterns of results, it proves that the variable is actually being measured. Okay. And just an important note here, psychologist S.S. Stevens suggested 4 different levels, and we're actually going to go into those levels right now of measurement in psychology studies and psychology research, etc. Okay. So the 4 different ways of assessing scores to individuals that provide increasing amounts of quantitative information about the characteristics being measured are as follows, okay? Nominal level types of variables, ordinal level types of variables, interval level types of variables, and ratio level types of variables, okay? The nominal level of measurement is used for categorical variables and involves assigning scores that are category labels. So for instance, identifying the gender of participants in a certain study or in a certain test is an example of a nominal level variable. The ordinal level of measurement involves assigning scores so that they represent the rank order of the individual. Okay, so ordinal level involves ranking and ordering individuals. So scores at the ordinal level tells us whether one individual has more or less of the characteristic of interest, but they do not tell us how much more or less. Okay. Interval level measurements involve assigning numerical scores so that a given difference between 2 scores always represents the same difference in characteristic of interest, but a score of 0 does not literally represent none or 0 of the characteristic. Okay, so an instance here would be measurements of like heat. Yeah, measurements of heat, like using like the Celsius scale rather than the Fahrenheit scale or the Fahrenheit scale, okay? Ratio level measurements involves assigning numerical scores so that a given difference between 2 scores always represents the same difference in the characteristic, and a score of 0 represents none of the characteristic, okay? So an example of a ratio level type of measurement would be like height and weight, okay? Before we get on to validity and reliability, which is in the second section of chapter 5, Stevens' level of measurements are important for 2 reasons. So the level of measurements we just went over, okay? Again, those are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So again, Stevens' level of measurements are important for 2 reasons. Emphasis on the generality of the concept of measurement and evaluation according to the same standard of reliability and validity that are used for other forms of measurements. And the second reason is that the levels of measurements can serve as a rough guide to the statistical procedures we can use with our data and the conclusions we can draw from them, okay? So just some quick takeaway points from the first section of chapter 5, psychological measurement. Measurement is the assignment of scores to individuals so that the scores represent some characteristic of the individuals. Psychological measurement can be achieved in a wide variety of ways, including self-report, behavioral, and physiological measures. Psychological constructs such as intelligence, self-esteem, and depression are variables that are not directly observable because they represent behavioral tendencies or complex patterns of behavior and internal processes. An important goal of scientific research is to conceptually define psychological constructs in ways that accurately describe them. For any conceptual definition of a construct, there will be many different operational definitions or ways of measuring it. The use of multiple operational definitions or converging operations is a common strategy in psychological research. And lastly, the variables can be measured at 4 different levels again: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. These can communicate increasing amounts of quantitative information. The level of measurement affects the kinds of statistics you can use and the conclusions you can draw from your data. So our second section of psychological measurement of this chapter goes into reliability and validity, okay? Psychologists do not simply assume that their measures work. Instead, we collect data to demonstrate that they actually work. In evaluating a measurement method, psychologists, yourselves included, will consider two general dimensions: reliability and validity. We're going to go first into reliability. Reliability means consistency, and it is a good thing in psychological measures. Psychologists consider three kinds of reliability: test-retest reliability, internal consistency, and inter-rater reliability. So test-retest reliability is the extent to which scores for a construct remain consistent over time. Assessing test-retest reliability requires collecting and analyzing data, repeating measures on the same set of people, and then looking at the test-retest correlation between the set of scores using a scatter plot. So for test-retest reliability, I actually want us to refer to figure 5.3, which is a figure of test-retest correlation between two sets of scores, okay? So pause the PowerPoint or the lecture, pause the lecture at this moment. So I actually paused with you guys, but so I probably will pause with you guys in general in the future. But again, this figure 5.3 in my book is of a test-retest correlation between two sets of scores of several college students, okay? These college students, or these scores in particular, are on the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which is given 2 times a week, and you can see that on the bottom, okay? Just so you guys remember, right? A test-retest correlation of, positive 0.80 is considered to indicate good reliability, okay? This test is good. In this case, right, and you'll have to go further into your own book, but in this case, it was a positive 0.95 or a positive 0.90. Sound good? Okay. So we will move on from that, but again, take some time to make sure, you pause at these figures. As I stated before, again, when we're on the figure, constructs that are generally stable have a high test-retest correlation. In that case, having a retest correlation of positive 0.80, definitely reliable, okay? The next kind of reliability testing that we can do is internal consistency. Internal consistency is the consistency of people's responses across the items on a multiple item measure. So one approach to this is the split half correlation. So this is splitting the items into 2 sets, such as the first and second half of the items, or the even and the odd number items, then computing a score for each set of items and examining the relationship between the 2 sets of scores. For this, we are actually going to refer to figure 5.3. And depending on your text, it might be like a figure point off. So for some of you, it might be figure 5.3 or 5.5, okay? But for me, the book that I have, it's figure 5.5. So here again, we have a figure of a split half correlation. So let me move my face up because my face is actually blocking this. Okay, here again, a split half correlation between several college students' scores on even numbered items and their scores on odd numbered items of the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. Okay, so once again, I want y'all to pause and check this figure out. So again here, this figure is showing a split half correlation between several college student scores on the even numbered items and their scores on the odd number items of the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. Here, Pearson's R for these data was positive 0.88, okay? A split of half correlation of positive 0.80 or greater is generally considered good internal consistency. So in this case, in this type of measure, right, we have good consistency, okay? It's reliable. So again, just pause if you need to understand this figure. Okay, so we just left from figure 5.4. So one other thing is that another measure is the statistic, called Cronbachs Alpha, which is the mean of all possible split half correlations for a set of items. Okay. So we've done that. So make sure you guys are pausing at these figures. We just went over split half correlation. Okay, and inter-rater reliability is not included in the PowerPoint. I don't know how I forgot that. But before we go on to validity, I do want to go on to the third kind of reliability that you should consider. Inter-rater reliability is the extent to which different observers are consistent in their judgment. It is often assessed using Cronbachs Alpha when the judgments are quantitative, or analogous statistic called Cohen's K when they are categorical, okay? So validity, okay? Validity is the extent to which the scores from measure represent the variable that they are intended to. A judgment about the extent scores on the measure represent the construct based on the available evidence. There are four kinds of validity. There is face validity, content validity, criterion validity, and discriminant validity, okay? So face validity is the extent to which a measurement method appears on its face to measure the construct of interest. It is measured at best to be a weak kind of evidence that a measurement method is measuring what it's supposed to. The MMPI is an example of a measurement or a measure that is generally reliable and valid, but does not necessarily appear to measure personality traits. Okay. Content validity. Remember, we're going over the four types of validity. Content validity is the extent to which a measure covers the construct of interest, okay? It is not assessed quantitatively, but is carefully checking the measurement method against the conceptual definition of the construct. Criterion validity is the extent to which people's score on a measure are correlated with other variables known as criteria that we would expect them to be correlated with. So a criterion can be any variable that we have reason to think should be correlated with the construct we are measuring. It requires collecting data using the measure. So an example of criterion validity would be John Cassiopos, sorry if my pronunciation, but John Cassiopos and Richard Petty's need for the cognition scale is an example of criterion validity, okay? And then lastly, discriminant validity is the extent to which scores on a measure are not correlated with measures of variables that are conceptually distinct. So for example, self-esteem is a fairly stable attitude towards the self, while mood is the present feeling. Therefore, people's scores on a measure of self-esteem should not be highly correlated, not correlated, but co-related with their moods. So the need for cognition scale showed no correlation between people's needs for cognition and measures of their test anxiety and their tendency to respond in socially desirable ways. So some takeaways from section 2 of chapter 5, right? Psychological researchers do not simply assume that their measures work. Instead, they conduct research to actually show that it works. If they cannot show that they work, they stop using them, okay? There are 2 distinct criteria which researchers evaluate their measures: reliability and validity. Reliability is consistency of across time, okay, and across items. So across time, remember those are test, retest reliability, and across items, internal consistency. Pardon. Validity, which is the other distinct criteria, is the extent to which the scores actually represent the variable that they're intended to. Validity is a judgment based on various types of evidence. The relevant evidence includes the measure's reliability, whether it covers the construct of interest, and whether the scores it produces are correlated with other variables they are expected to be correlated with, and not correlated with variables that are conceptually distinct. Lastly, the reliability and validity of a measure is not established by any single study, but the pattern of result across multiple studies. The assessment of reliability and validity is an always ongoing process. Okay, psychology, so let's get to the final section, okay? So this section is on practical strategies for psychological measurement, okay? So there are 4 broad steps in the process of measuring a psychological construct for a research project. These 4 steps are listed on your screen right now: conceptually defining the construct, operationally defining the construct, implementing the measure, and then evaluating the measure. And we're going to go through each one of these steps right now. So the first step: have a clear and complete conceptual definition of a construct. This is a prerequisite for a good measurement. And the reason why is that it allows one to make sound decisions about exactly how to measure a construct. That's the first step, okay? So our second step is operationally defining the construct. So you can use a pre-existing definition from previous research from other people, or you can create one. So we'll talk about both of these, okay? So our author, Paul Price, says that it's better to decide on an operational definition using an existing measure from successful research. The reason why he says it's better to decide on an operational definition that's been used in previous research is it saves time, okay? So it saves the time needed to create an original one. There is some evidence that the measure is already valid. The new results can be compared to and combined with previous results. And then also the Dictionary of Unpublished Experimental Measures is an extensive catalog of measures that have been used in previous research, where you can actually get your operational definition from. So many existing measures, especially those that have application in clinical psychology, are proprietary, okay? But you can also create your own measure, okay? So one can also create a measure. okay? And again, we're still operationally defining our construct. This is step 2. You can also create your own measure. So when one creates an own measure, it's important to create a set of clear instructions using simple language that you can present in writing or read aloud, or even both. It's also a good idea to include one or more practice items so that participants can be familiar with the task and build an opportunity for them to ask questions before continuing. It is best to keep the measure brief to avoid boring or frustrating participants to the point that their responses start to become less reliable and valid. It is also better for a measure to include multiple items rather than a single one because, one, they are necessary to adequately cover a construct, and 2, right, a single response can often be influenced by irrelevant factors. Finally, right, if you create your own measure, it's advisable to conduct a small-scale pilot test of any new measure to detect any potential problems with it, okay? So our third step in the measurement process is actually implementing the measure, okay? While implementing a measure, it is best to remember the following. Ideally, everyone should be tested under similar conditions. Disagreeable participants may intentionally respond in ways that cause problems in the study. This is called reactivity, okay? Agreeable participants may respond in ways that they believe they are expected to. So for example, they may engage in socially desirable responding ways, okay? Research studies can also have a built-in demand characteristic, which are cues how the researcher wants the participant to behave, okay? To avoid these problems, so reactivity, socially desirable responding, and demanding characteristics, to avoid these problems, a researcher should make the procedures as brief and as clear as possible, guarantee the participant's anonymity. It's important to inform the participants about the research, but not divulge information that may influence them to respond in particular ways. It's also better to administer the measure by a helper who is unaware of its intent or any hypothesis being tested. Once there is a measure on a sample of people and you have a set of scores, the researcher in this position can now evaluate it more thoroughly, okay? So the final step, evaluating the measure, okay? So again, once there is a measure on a sample of people and you have a set of scores, the researcher is in a position to evaluate it more thoroughly in terms of reliability and validity. We went over that in the second section of this chapter, okay? In most research designs, it is not possible to assess test-retest reliability because participants are tested at only one time. It is also customary to assess internal consistency for any multiple item measure, usually by looking at a split half correlation or Cronbachs Alpha. Criterion and discriminant validity can be assessed in various ways, remember. A successful experimental manipulation also provides evidence of criterion validity, okay? However, if the newly collected data in a study casts doubt on the reliability or validity of a measure, this can mean several things. Something could be obviously wrong with the measure or how it was administered. Something could be wrong with your conceptual definition, and the experiment may have manipulated and failed, okay? This indicates that it's necessary to revise the measure, revise the conceptual definition, or even try a new manipulation, okay? So again, there are some important key terms that I just mentioned towards the end. Make sure, let me move my face, make sure you guys go over that, okay? So you can pause here. Let me move my face. Pause here, okay? But some key takeaways before I get rid of my face on the screen from this last section is good measurement begins with a clear conceptual definition of the construct to be measured. This is accomplished by both clear and detailed thinking and a review of the research literature. You often have the option of using an existing measure or creating a new measure. You should make this decision based on the availability of the existing measures that are already around and their adequacy for your specific purpose. Several simple steps can be taken in creating a new measure and also in implementing both existing and new measures that can help maximize your reliability and validity. Once you have used the measure, you should reevaluate its reliability and validity based on your new data. But remember that the assessment of reliability and validity is always an ongoing process. So I will see you guys later. And as usual, if you have any questions, please just email me. But in regards to this chapter, that's it. Bye, guys.